This afternoon's session is called Histories and the Politics of Land Acquisition. And I am the chair, Sanjay Reddy. And our first speaker is Nirmola Sharma, who is a doctoral candidate in East Asian Studies at the University of Delhi. Yes. So let me turn it over to her. She'll be speaking for up to 15 minutes on Compulsions and Contestations of Ideology, the Indian National Army's Justification for Collaboration with the Japanese in Occupied China, 1942 to 45. Nirmola.
Thank you. So, I would like to begin by thanking New School for giving me this opportunity to come here and present this paper. This is a work in progress, so I have presented it a few places, and the motivation was to get feedback and how can I, rework my paper in a better way. So I look forward to your comments and criticism. As you can see, the paper is called Compulsions and Contestations of Ideology, the INA's Justification for Collaboration with the Japanese in Occupied China. Before I start, I would like to tell, for people who are not aware of what the Indian National Army was.
Press F5.
Sorry about that. So the Indian National Army was an army which came into force in Southeast Asia, and it was organized by Indian nationalist leaders, and who were in Japan and in Southeast Asia, and primarily formed with Japanese help and consisted of Indian prisoners of wars. But it also had quite a lot of support from the Indian civilian population in Southeast Asia. Two persons played, I would just name two persons here, but there were other people as well. Ras Bihari Bose, an Indian nationalist leader who had escaped to Japan and lived there, played a very important role in the establishment of the Indian National Army. And then the other person was Subhash Chandra Bose, a very important nationalist leader of India, controversial at times, but these were the two personalities who kind of played an important role. Now, in my presentation, I'm going to talk about primarily about the Indian National Army in China. Before I talk about it, I would like to mention that the Indian National Army has been studied by a lot of people. A lot of works have come out. The China aspects of the Indian National Army's presence has not been highlighted that much. In fact, not many people are aware that the Indian National Army was there in China. So, and if I actually finish this work, this would probably be the first work that has, kind of focused on it. Now, the Indian National Army in China was primarily, in terms of supporters and followers, with the Indian population in China. Most of the Indian population in China were in centers like Shanghai, Hong Kong, Nanjing, Hangzhou, Tianjin, Macau, and Canton. And these people primarily consisted of soldiers, policemen, watchmen, and political exiles. Now, what do I want to look in the paper? So basically, my primary hypothesis is that the Indian National Army actually engaged in the construction of a new alternative discourse on China, on the Japanese occupation of China, which I have called as the China question. It was a problem they tried to address throughout the 3 years of their that existed. And in the paper, I've looked at what were the methods that were used to construct this alternative discourse, and what were the features of this INA's discourse in China, and who was it addressed to. Now, the INA's discourse on China was primarily focused on to oppose the already established discourse on the China question, which was the Indian National Congress discourse. Now, this discourse was a discourse of sympathy with the Chinese and and indignation for what the Japanese perpetrated in China. Sorry. So it was a discourse just shaped largely by the policy of opposition to imperialism and support to the fellow sufferer of imperialism. This was also the time when Nehru, and we hear about the famed friendship of Nehru and Chakashik. Subhash Chandra Bose plays in this paper, because it lasted for a very small period, 3 years to be precise. So no, they didn't really come up with any policy directives on China. So I have basically looked at the pronouncements of Bose, because he was the main leader, as well as writings in various propaganda magazines and other articles, and tried to reconstruct a story, reconstruct what they thought, what was their stand on the China question, on the Japanese occupation of China. So before I tell what INA's stand was on China, I would like to go back and tell you what Bose said about China in the pre-INA days. Subhash Chandra Bose was a key member of the Congress Party. He had also been a president. During his period of membership in the Congress, Bose had at times denounced Japanese aggression in China and supported the Chinese masses. And many times he had likened Japan as the British of the East, and found that the Chinese were more humankind and ethical vis-a-vis the Japanese. And there's this quote which he, in a speech given, where he said that it is necessary for us to think of the means of preventing the growth of Japanese imperialism in Asia. If tomorrow China could be strong and united, I'm sure it would serve to check the spread of Japanese imperialism. This is Bose in 1936. Now, why was the need to have a new discourse in China? I say it was because to legitimize collaboration with Japan, but also it was very important to have to provide a convincing narrative on China, or the Japanese occupation of China, and most importantly to counter the already established Congress discourse of sympathy. Now, the Indians in China, there was this history of revolutionary mobilization among the Indians in China, and but the Indian National Congress was still widely supported by the Indian community in China. So the stand of the Indian community prior to INA was that of sympathy with the Chinese. And when Raja Mahendra Pratap, he was also a very renowned nationalist who had lived in Japan for a long time, visited China to establish a golden corps of army, like pro-Japan army. He was castigated by the Indian community in China. So the primary idea was to allay the fears of the Indians in China vis-a-vis Japan, and to seek the support of the Indians at home as well as abroad. As I mentioned, it was primarily aimed at to legitimize collaboration with imperialist Japan, which meant that they had to reinterpret the situation in China. It also meant that they had to reverse quite a lot of earlier held perceptions of China and Japan, and this they did by a dualistic method. I have dealt with it in the paper. Now, what was the major features of INA's discourse on China? The most important feature was the need to have a pragmatic approach by Indians to the war situation, to make the most of the war situation. And Bose had, even in his days in the Congress, reiterated that foreign policy should not be driven by morality and emotional needs. So I think this was a time where he actually put to use what he had always thought of, that we shouldn't be foreign policies should not be driven by morality. Now, in this new discourse on Japanese occupation of China, the INA made liberal use of Japanese concept of Pan-Asianism. Now, this meant that redefinition of Japan and Japan's role in Asia and particularly in China. So a distinction was made between old Japan, which was militarist, imperialist, vis-a-vis a new Japan, which was harbinger of peace and stability in Asia, and who was actually fighting for the liberation of Asia from Western imperialism. Now, it also meant that they were looking at China from a very Japanese perspective. Chiang Kai-shek is criticized heavily in this new discourse of INA's discourse on China as being haughty and not promoting, as creating obstacle to the national unification of China, which Japan was promoting. Now, this also meant that Wang Qingwei's government, which was a pro-Japan, Japan-backed government, was supported by the INA vis-a-vis Chiang Kai-shek's government. So Wang Qingwei's government formed the national government, while Chiang Kai-shek is projected as the corrupt government who is creating obstruction to national unification and national reconstruction of China. This also meant that there was a spatial reconsideration of the problems of China. So this is not an external problem. I mean, our foreign policy should not be driven by what is happening inside China. This is an internal problem, and let them sort it out. Like the Chinese are fighting among themselves, like the Wang Qingwei's government and the KMT. So these were the major features of this new discourse, INA's discourse on China. To conclude, I'd like to point out that throughout the 3 years of its existence, they deliberately tried to address the China question in many of its speeches. And in fact, when you look at the speeches of Subhash Chandra Bose throughout this period, even to a letter to Mahatma Gandhi, the China question keeps coming very frequently. There's small passages here and there, but the China question, along with that India should not, criticizing the British for its policies, the China question comes very frequently. So it was a very important problem which they tried to address, but it was also driven by compulsions to ally with Japan, and of course characterized by contestations. In its attempt to legitimize its alliance with Japan, it also attempted to legitimize to a great extent Japanese occupation of China. And as I mentioned before, it also gave a new spin to many of the earlier held perceptions. And most importantly, this new discourse was characterized by silences on many aspects of the controversial aspects of Japanese occupation of China. They simply didn't talk about. And it was also characterized by inherent contradictions which remained. So that's why I say it was contested. It was not a very logically it was not logical, but at the same time, by the end of by 44, the entire Indian population in China, almost the entire, I wouldn't say entire, almost the entire Indian population in China had become part of or become members of the Indian National Army. So I would say they were to a great extent successful in addressing the China question as far as its reach to the Indians in China was concerned. Before I still have some. These are some of the pictures which I've showed it at many places, but for people who haven't seen it, this was Bose in Shanghai when he had visited in Shanghai, and you can see many Indians there at the bottom, Sikh soldiers. And this was one of the magazines which was published by the Indian National Army headquarters in Shanghai. It was called Chalo Delhi. And this is an ID card from the Indian National Army, ID card which mentions the name of the person and the addresses and all. This is also an ID card, a membership form which one had to fill to become a member of the Indian National Army. And this is Indians demonstrating in Shanghai. This is the training center, Azad Hind Fauj Training Center in Shanghai. Thank you.
Very good. So, thank you. We have our second speaker, Huang Yinghong, Between Justice and Development, Mixed Stories of Land Acquisition in India and China.
Thank you, Chairperson. Before I start my talk, I would like to thank ICI for providing such a wonderful opportunity for me to hear. Today my topic is about Between Justice and Development, the mixed stories of land acquisition in India and China. Why I come to this issue, I think there's a big issue in India and China, like I list in this slide. Actually, modernity, that means some kind, especially in the Western, we define it as the shift from the agricultural society into an industrial or post-industrial society. And inside of the land is a very important thing. That means we need to extract human resource, we need to capital from the agriculture, and then to shift to the industrial. So then is a very important thing, one of them. So this is far more than concern of the economic development. I think it is also politically, it's also culturally and socially. So this is my long-term project, one of my long-term projects. But here I cannot deal all of them. Here what I try to apply is the landscape of the land acquisition issues in India and China. I'm not to explain anything. I'm trying to describe the brief picture of different aspects of land acquisition in India and China. I think this is the best for my basic things for my further research. The content is that first we should look into what's the nature of land acquisition, especially land acquisition for development. What does it mean? This is why I'm working first. Another is define my research in this paper, the background and the main concerns. Then the main part of my talk is the mixed stories of land acquisition and between both countries. The fourth session is about conclusion and implication for further research. This is some kind of abbreviations. Now it is the nature of land acquisition. Land acquisition is compulsory acquired land from the rural displaced groups. I use the rural displaced groups just because in Indian's case, there's more complex. There's no only person. Because the land ownership between land ownership in India is different from China. So there are some people like talents and like workers in the farms. They're different. But in China, they are only persons. There are no talents and some kind of things. They may have, but not so many as in India. So this is the political group, and transfer it to the requiring bodies, especially for private or public companies, by the state and the land of the public purpose. So, but land acquisition for development is likely to incur some debate. First is the compulsory acquisition. That means the state acquire the land without the consent of the persons, of the owners. So this is likely to incur the debate. Another thing is public purpose. Is development purpose is a part of the public purpose? Sometimes it is debatable. Another thing is the different rent of the land varying to its usage. As we know, land for real estate is higher than land for industrial usage. And industrial usage is higher for agriculture. So how to divide and how to distribute this increased value? That will be a big problem. But why they take land acquisition for why they don't just leave the company to discuss the land price with the landowners? Just because they have some other concern. First is they want to reduce the high cost of the negotiation with the sporadic owners. They try to avoid the control of the biggest owner or the land mafia, and they try to avoid the usage for real estate to take up priority. And first, most important thing is the state want to achieve desirable development perceived by the state. So it is a developmental state, or to be developmental state, like in the case of India. They use land acquisition to meet the growing need for land for development. Yes. So, and there's, in this case, there are two possible results. One is win-win game. That means all status of the three parties are improved, and they are all satisfied with this kind of improvement. There is zero-sum game. Some improve, some lose, or some feel lose. And then we will look into what extent the win-win game is there in both cases, and how much the zero-sum gains occurred, and what's the meanings behind them. So I think this is far more than this is some kind of distribution of the value. This is also as well a political issue, not only economy issue. So that's why I'm arguing that the justice and development should be secured in the land acquisition. A balance of both them are extremely needed. In this talk, we've seen the developmental state since 1980s, who take land acquisition as the main agent to meet the growing demand for land for development. And the main concern is what region they adopt, what kind of practice in these both countries, and what's the performance of them. And let me go to the main part. There's many stories. I think there's rather than only one picture in the land acquisition in India and China. We can find that there are similar regulations with similar dynamics of land acquisition. There are similar components toward the land acquisition in India and China. And as well, they are different general performance on the whole. But they also have some local creative practice we can find in both cases. Similar region, that means that actually since 1980s, especially like in India in 1984, there is a revision of the land acquisition law in India. They revised the land acquisition, the aid for company into the public purpose. That means land acquisition are allowed to take for public purpose as well as public for companies. So this is a big change. Another thing is China. There's 1980s, 1982. The land are claimed, the urban land are claimed to be owned by state. At the same time, there is established of the use right of the land, and the state become the monopoly of the land, the first land market. So only the government can acquire the land and show them to the companies, and then this is the only option in China. So this is a big change since 1980s. Another thing we need to mention is about since 2000, they tried to establish the rehabilitation and resettlement policy, but all of them failed. At the end till now, we can find that actually the politics growing since 2000, even though both countries they try to perfect their region, so they fail at the end. And the land acquisition in India and China, the best region is very similar. So state acquire land and transfer to the required body in India. But in China, some difference is only that the state also the state show the land to the requiring body. So there is the land revenue in China. This is some difference inside it. Similar complaints toward land acquisition, particularly since 2000. We can see they are different. There are similar complaints. One is displacement to the displaced group. They came to improvement. And there is violent behavior of government. And in India, that's the main reason for the investment stagnance. And too much land acquired and actually needed. Similar things happen in China. Low compensation without resettlement, violent behavior of the government and land financial of local government. A huge amount of land left without being used after acquired. But there is different general performance on the whole. The first thing is there are two-thirds of different attitude toward land acquisition of peasant in China, which cannot be found in case of India. Another thing is that Chinese land acquisition put forward even under failure practice since 2000, while land acquisition in India are as stagnant due to the practice. This is the different force of performance and acquisition. In China, you can find that now to 1998, there is a big difference. Before that, negotiation goes smoothly, and sometimes the persons they would like to submit their land. They treat land as some kind of burden at the time. But after that, some things turn different. And the contribution development is totally different. Like that is the negotiation acquired. On the whole, we can find that since 2000, China's negotiation, the total amount is much higher than the before. But in the next we can find in the next one we can find that Indians' investment are extended due to land acquisition. It is about 600 projects and valued $100 billion are extended due to land acquisition. And this is the difference of the urbanization rate in India and China, as Zheng Yu mentioned before. And this is the different contribution of the secondary and sector and GDP in India and China. We can find that in India is far less. The main contributor is the service, the third industry. But in China, we can find that the third one and the second one, both of them contribute to the high economic growth. So that means the contribution to economic growth is very different. But we can find other sets of stories. There's the local creative practice. I call it local creative practice. Was found in both cases. Like in this is a report in Shenzhen. It is said that millionaire was made due to the land acquisition. And even some people tell me that like in Guangzhou, people are waiting for land acquisition. And some of them shipped to Singapore after land acquisition. Another thing is like in India, we can find in Gujarat, it's reported that colored party that was made due to the land acquisition. And there are different kind of practice. Like we can find that this kind of like Nanhai, and even in Shenzhen, I find it there. We can find that the person that built their own industrial park, and then they lease it to the small companies or big companies. And so that they don't need to acquire land. All they need to do is to allow them to do this, give them the plan of the land. Another thing is like in Chengdu, there's more companies. But on the whole, is like the government reorganized the rural land and just buy the extra construct land from the later, then sell to the requiring body, and the requiring body build new buildings for the displaced group. So all the three parties' status are improved in this practice. In Gujarat, there is something like land bank and land pooling. Like this land pooling, we can find that the state acquired only 40% of the land, and they return 60% of the land to the displaced group, to the landowners. And in this 40%, they will use it for like infrastructure and like for land bank for further development. So in this case, both of the three parties' status can be improved. So that's my conclusion. There's mixed stories rather than one stories in India and China and land acquisition. And generally speaking, we can say that in both cases, we can find that there are good stories and bad stories, the heavy story and bloody stories. And there are also generally national pictures that we can find. There are also special local pictures we can find. And between the both cases, generally we can say that in China there's one excellent period of land acquisition before 2000, but after that it's different. Another thing is that for China, it can put forward land acquisition under the very furious protest, but this did not happen in India. So for further research, we need to do into what variable they contribute to a different performance, even under similar pressure and protest. That's why I already work in the NUS 3 months. I just returned from NUS. I'm working on the Singular and Wukan. Another thing we need to, we need to see how the local creative regulation can be possible under same national framework. Sometimes they are illegal at the beginning. Sometimes they are legal, sometimes they are illegal. But this did happen. And this may, sometimes they may all the parties satisfied. So what's the politics behind them? This we need to see. And what will the new region, like India, there's LRR, and China, there will become a new land administration law. So what they will bring to the change? That's the further research. Okay, that's all. Thank you for the attention.
Prakash Kashwan, Institutional Political Economy of Land Acquisition in India, with a glance over the Himalayas.
I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for this opportunity to share some of this research. I want to start by saying a couple of sentences about sort of background to my work. I've been trained in one variation of institutional analysis, political economy, micro-political economy. And I'm trying to build on that by bringing in insights from a variety of social science disciplines. So, I call myself the Google Scholar generation of scholars. When I do Google Scholar search, I rarely actually look at the name of the journal. So I'm typing keywords that are based on a practical description of my problem, say land acquisition or whatever, and then if I find a paper in history journal, I'll read that, right? So I'm not wedded to a particular disciplinary tradition, and that sometimes is confusing, but sometimes hopefully rewarding. So let me begin by sort of giving you an outline. I want to lay out my motivation in the politics of land acquisition in India. And it's a process that's going through transition, and I want to look at transition from a particular perspective. I'll lay out the key questions. I'll describe briefly the methods, the theoretical framework, and then I want to get into what I call as the political foundation of property rights. And I'll talk about how the idea of property rights or land rights is conceptualized among different sections of Indian population and at different hierarchical levels of Indian political system, and what it means for scholars to sort of understand and study the politics of land acquisition under such conditions. So briefly, to describe the land acquisition process, we have this glorious tradition of colonial era Land Acquisition Act of 1894, which was active until the day before yesterday. And there are strong foundations in the conceptual parameters of eminent domain, public interest versus urgency clause, and non-justiciability of the land acquisition process. So it's not some law which is out there and is not used or whatever, but it is very strongly founded law, the implications of which actually permeate throughout the political system in many, many ways, and I hope to talk about some of that. Now, because of this clearly unjust and colonial era practices, there have been lots of fights and conflicts, and very visible ones, some of them. And because of that, the Indian government has responded by bringing out this land acquisition law, new law, which was enacted by the end of 2013 and came into effect January 1st. Some of the salient features of this law is that the compensation has been increased many-fold, particularly in rural areas, because the rural land markets are undervalued. The compensation for non-landholders who are dependent on the land. That's a really radical sort of provision, which is in the formal law now. Governments and companies would require prior and informed consent of 70% of the affected people, including those people who are not landowners, right? And they require a very exhaustive social impact assessment. All of these are very, very radical provisions in many, many ways. And so based on this, and based on all the protests and movements that you've seen, Many analysts, including Sanjay Chakravarti, who has come out with this recent book, he's basically arguing that the history of primitive and crony capitalism and state corruption and greed and insensitivity has ended, right? So the argument is that there's a new shift in the land acquisition politics in India. And, but on the other hand, there are many people, including myself, who would argue that this picture looks very different when you look at the whole issue from the perspective of land rights movements. This would have been another paper, but let me just say that right around the time when the new law was being debated, a huge land rights movement had to sort of resort to some kind of face-saving exercise with the government. Government carried the day in a movement that was threatening to walk 10,000 people over 2,075 miles, right? In the end, long story short, in the end, government prevailed, right? And right now, it seems that Congress is not even worried as so much as to put anything of that in their manifesto in the current ongoing elections. So there are two different views of what's going on in the Indian land acquisition politics. And my argument is that these two different views are partly related to the theoretical frameworks that different scholars use to analyze land acquisition politics. I'll briefly try to lay out the sort of dominant framework and then lay out an alternative framework and use that also to do an empirical sort of argument about the politics of land acquisition, and then to use that to say something about comparative analysis, ambitious agenda. So the key questions, my point of departure is that land acquisition is about redefining land relations or property rights relations, right? As opposed to changing some statutory law or framework. And then, as I said, I look at it from two different types of institutional frameworks and want to raise this question as to what it what difference does it make whether you use one type of theoretical framework opposed to another type of theoretical framework. And finally, what are the implications for India-China comparative analysis? I'll come back to these pictures a little later in the presentation. Partly as a response to comments that I received from colleagues, I turned my presentation upside down. So this is for the reviewers if you are wondering what's going on in the presentation. My research approach, I briefly want to sort of talk about, generally we talk about either an inductive or a deductive approach. And my argument is that none of these approaches by themselves work really well when we are talking about, phenomenon that goes across historical sort of temporal dimension, cross-scale, national versus local, and leave alone cross-national arguments, and then interdisciplinary. You bring in political, economic, and social consideration into your argument. Then, what works is what is called as abductive or recursive sort of approach, which is more or less similar to, if you think about how doctors actually diagnose diseases and symptoms and go back and forth between theory and empirical observation. That's the kind of approach that I'm trying to sort of develop vis-a-vis this particular question. In addition to my own field research, a full year of research in Gujarat in 2009, and I look at studies that are field research based, ethnographic studies, in whichever discipline, but I draw on them as if I'm going there and conducting a proxy sort of field work, which is different from the standard secondary references to the literature. Finally, I also bring to this my 15-year-long engagement with the question of forest and land rights through practice and activism and with a variety of engagements with social movements, NGOs, and so forth. Some of those pictures here. This is my claim to fame as far as photography is concerned. This was published on the cover of a magazine. So the key debates in property rights literature have to do with, one, there's this standard economic theory of property rights. Scarcity leads to increased valuation, which leads to people, asserting exclusive property rights. But there's a background scaffolding of the rule of law. Next step is the sort of new institutional economics, which talks about the information and the behavioral conditions that lead to particular kind of actions vis-a-vis any outcome. But here in this particular context, property rights are understood as a hierarchy of rule-bound rights, right, which can be exercised within the context of a particular kind of legal or institutional framework. And finally, we have the social anthropology and sort of the other theories which talk about relational dimensions of property rights in terms of, property rights being embedded in social and cultural relations. I engaged with that argument, but will not do that in this paper. But if you, press me, I'll be happy to sort of, talk how I think about those arguments vis-a-vis the approach that I'm laying out here. But none of these approaches actually engage with the politics of power or the politics of strategic maneuvering on the part of all kinds of actors, right? Not just state actors, but actors in society, civil society, and so forth. So I basically what I'm doing is thickening the plot vis-a-vis institutional economics to use that to sort of. Now, I want you to sort of take a moment to look at this picture. These are leaders, local leaders, village leaders, traditional leaders in Gujarat. And so, if you take a moment to look at their facial expressions and their mustaches and how they go together in an expression of articulation of power. But they are sitting on a swing. I don't know if some of you use that. And it's a very tricky thing to sit on, But you imagine moving this swing like almost 80 degrees, and these leaders will stay exactly like that, with their facial expressions, with their body being stiff and everything, right? Now, my argument is that none of the predominant theories of property rights balance nearly as well as these leaders do. And this is the references to the swinging politics of rural land processes and land relations. How do we actually make these theories sit on this swing without actually, hobbling up this thing? So the political economy of institution perspective that I bring to this debate is basically based on this idea that property rights, as well as many other kinds of institutions, are an outcome of historical struggles around state making, state building, control, territorial control, and all of that sort of literature. And I particularly read David Ludden's work and Dharma Kumar, who's an Indian economist, if you read some of them. And people often justify their land rights in terms of references to state legitimation that has been received by some authority from state, either because of allocation of land rights or because of some historical connection with the authority, right? So state is not that, out there, up there structure which is sort of magically, moving people like puppets, but it is, seen as being experienced and understood by citizens. This is the everyday state literature, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And I find this phrase of disaggregated unity. The state presents a disaggregated unity at the local level, and people engage with the state with the entrenched authority of the state at the local level. The same model in a different way. I have a more complicated one, but I left it out of the presentation. So in the paper, I describe how the Indian sort of cultural, whatever, idea of property rights is founded very closely to link to the Lockean framework of, the labor value of property and land and so forth. And the collection of tribute by the state authorities or state authorized agents has been routinized and legitimized for a long, long time. It is very strongly embedded in the thinking, so that when I exercise my land rights, I'm paying a land tax for exercising land rights, not in expectation of some future public goods delivery, which is the standard sort of discussion in the literature. And to make this happen, Indian state, beginning the medieval era, has put up a very strong middle structure of leaders and intermediaries. One of those is called police patel. Now, if you think about this term, it brings the idea of traditional leader of patel with the modern idea of police, and these guys continue to be active even today in the politics of land rights and land acquisition. I'm running out of time, and I'm sort of wondering. So, one of the dimensions of eminent domain, which is often not talked about in the standard discussions of land acquisition, is that almost 45% of the land is completely owned and controlled by the state, right? But there are huge populations of people who are dependent on these state-owned lands. So the exercise of eminent domain in these 45% of the Indian land is sort of, institutionalized. It's taken for granted. They don't even have to formally notify anybody so far, prior to this law. And then, we have all of these commons, village lands and so forth, which are often thought of as common property, but they are actually state-owned lands in practice. And so all of this actually leaves out 75% of the cases of land acquisition have very little to do with private land, property rights, compensation, and all of that, particularly historically. And increasingly, I think we'll see more and more of the real private land being acquired. So if you look at the perspective of people who are affected by the politics of land rights, much of the current discussion actually does not speak to the politics of land acquisition of the commons and other kinds of lands, in which the state actually exercises an absolute territorial power. Now, don't be mistaken, this is not, again, an idea of an omnipotent state, but the state kind of feeds into an ongoing and long-standing agrarian crisis, which is leading to a very serious kind of agrarian differentiation at the local level, which means that within local communities who have people who are willing to reach out to the state and invite the state to acquire land, for example, so that they can be the middlemen and brokers and so forth. Right? So you have an edifice of law and a legal jurisprudence supported by people at the local level, agents at the local level who are willing to act as the willing accomplices of the state. Right? And then when you have all of this going on for a long, long time, think about a poor man who's trying to secure their interest in the context of this structure of both the dominant legal structure, but also the local differentiation, which means that state and state agents will always find some partners at the local level. So as a poor man, I want to respond to this reality that I'm faced with, right? Not with some notion of citizen demanding their rights or somebody asserting their land rights. So when you think about the responses of local people in that context, then the entire idea of analyzing federal structure, electoral politics, and local government from a formal institutional perspective seems almost, irrelevant in many, many ways, right? I'm saying that for the sake of sort of exaggeration, but I'm saying there's a lot more going on than just looking at the formal institutional processes, right? Okay, I'll skip through this, but here, I'm trying to argue how on the one hand you have the problems which are being addressed in certain limited pockets of Indian population and Indian politics, which means that landowners who are maybe 10% or 15% of the total population which is affected by land acquisition, they are gaining in the process, right? And they are the most visible actors. Media and many kind of academic analyses are focused on that, because that's the idea that the prevailing frameworks can actually easily latch onto. So there is a state, there's society, there's struggle between state and society. I'm trying to argue that it is far more complicated, and there are not only inter-regional variations and interstate variations, but there are intrastate, intra-district, intra-village, intra-community differences. One of the studies in Jaipur actually talks about two brothers who were affected in diametrically opposite ways by the same project, which was acquiring land in their village, right? So looking at this kind of disaggregated dynamics, it's not about sort of adding more details. It's about trying to see the whole dynamics in a new light, so that whatever we are seeing is a partial reality, and that's a very distorting partial reality as far as the whole picture is concerned. And that's why we actually see more land acquisition, as my predecessor actually talked about. See more land acquisitions than are required. We see many more land acquisitions that have happened without any protest, right? But the scholarship somehow tend to focus on the protest and the outcomes of the protest. One of the things, and this brings back to the sort of idea of cultural notions of property. The picture here is the jarib. It is the chain which is used for land surveys. And this was invented, I think, by the Mughal land administrators who were trying to figure out how to measure land. So these are the pictures of the jarib. And there have been many instances in which NGOs trying to help out the community for the sake of protecting their land rights have been objected against by the community members who object to the NGO's right to hold this jarib, because it's supposed to be the most authoritative symbol of state's authority to allocate land rights at the local level. And people will believe in the process only when that jarib is held by a state agent who's called an Amin. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.